A quiet black woman in worn sneakers and a second-hand hoodie walks into an adoption agency with hope in her eyes. The space is sterile, cold, and smells of antiseptic and false promises. She is there to adopt a little girl, a child whose picture has been taped to the inside of her heart for months, but she is about to be publicly humiliated. She is about to be denied the chance to be a mother, mocked for her supposed low income and dismissed as unfit. The arrogant staff, blinded by prejudice, have no idea who she is. They don't know that she is the silent billionaire who funds the very agency that is about to deny her. They don't know that she has the power to shatter their world with a single phone call. And when she returns, with the full force of the board of directors behind her, jaws will drop, heads will roll, and lives will change forever. Before we find out what happens next, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story is already hitting home, make sure you hit that like button. The waiting room of the Georgia Family Aspirations Adoption Agency was designed to feel calming, but it only felt cold. The walls were a pale, lifeless gray. The chairs were hard plastic, and the air hummed with the low, oppressive buzz of fluorescent lights. It was a place where hope came to be processed, filed, and often lost in the shuffle. Danielle Price, known to everyone in her small, private world as Danny, sat patiently, her hands resting in the lap of her faded jeans. She wore a simple gray hoodie, its sleeves pushed up to her elbows, and a pair of worn-out sneakers she'd owned for years. She looked like 1,000 other people just trying to get by, and that was exactly the point. Her gaze kept drifting to a photo on the agency's wall of hope. It was a picture of a little girl with bright, curious eyes and a smile that seemed to fight its way through a world of uncertainty. The girl's name was Ava. She was 6 years old, and for months, Danny had been moving heaven and earth to become her mother. She had filled out every form, submitted every document, and passed every background check with flawless precision. Her paperwork was a fortress of stability and preparedness. She had aced every test, every interview, every psychological evaluation. There was only one obstacle left, a final gatekeeper, who held all the power. Her name was Martha Whitcomb. A tinny voice crackled from a small speaker on the wall. Danielle Price? Danny stood, her heart giving a hopeful little leap. She smoothed down her hoodie and walked toward the closed office door, a gentle smile on her face. This was it. The final step. Inside the office, Martha Whitcomb sat behind a large, imposing oak desk. She was a woman in her late 50s, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair that looked as rigid as her posture. She wore a string of pearls and a silk blouse, a uniform of suburban superiority. Her eyes, sharp and judgmental, scanned Danny from head to toe before she even said a word. The assessment was instant, and it was brutal. Martha's lips tightened into a thin, dismissive line. She gestured vaguely toward the chair opposite her desk, not bothering to make eye contact. "Sit," she commanded, her voice crisp and unwelcoming. Danny sat, placing her simple cloth purse on the floor beside her. She remained calm, her posture open and relaxed, a stark contrast to the woman across from her. Martha picked up a thick file from her desk. It had Danny's name on it. She didn't open it, she just held it, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the cover as if it were contaminated. The office door was still slightly ajar, and the sounds of the waiting room trickled in. Other families were out there, listening. "Miss Price," Martha began, her tone dripping with condescension. She looked up from the file, her gaze landing on Danny's simple clothes, with theatrical disdain. "We have reviewed your application." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air like a threat. "Here at Family Aspirations, we are looking for stable, successful parents to place our children with. We have a standard to maintain." Danny simply nodded, waiting for her to continue. She knew what was coming. She had seen this behavior before, in whispers and sideways glances during her previous visits, but she had to see it through. She had to know just how broken the system truly was. Martha's voice grew louder, sharpened with a cruel edge that was clearly meant to carry. "We are looking for families who can provide not just love, but resources, opportunity. We are not a charity." She finally opened the file, but only glanced at the top page, her expression twisting into a sneer. She scoffed, a short, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet room. "Frankly, Miss Price, we're not in the business of handing children over to charity cases." A gasp was audible from the waiting room. Someone whispered, "Oh, My God. Danny felt the sting of the words, but her face remained a mask of polite composure. Inside, her heart ached, not for herself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel small within these walls. A woman in the waiting room, a hopeful mother herself, covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with shock. A young man, an intern with kind eyes, froze by the water cooler, his face paling. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Martha, emboldened by the reaction, leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, yet still very loud, whisper. "You don't look like someone who could properly care for a child," she said, her eyes raking over Danny's hoodie again. "The clothes you wear, the general impression you give, it doesn't scream stability." She pushed the file away as if it were dirty. "Perhaps you'd be better off applying for support from the state, not custody of a child." The humiliation was thick and suffocating. It was public, it was deliberate, and it was cruel. Danny felt a slow burn of anger, but she pushed it down, deep, deep down. Rage was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Her mission was too important. She cleared her throat, her voice steady and clear. "Mum, my financial records are all in the file. They are impeccable. I've passed every other part of the evaluation. Could you please clarify what specific requirement I haven't met?" Martha waved a dismissive hand, cutting her off. "Paperwork can be deceiving. We use our discretion here. It's our duty. We don't give children to people who can't afford to raise them with a certain level of dignity." She stood up, a clear signal that the meeting was over. Her voice became loud and formal again. A final performance for the audience in the waiting room. In full view of everyone, she looked Danny straight in the eye and delivered the final blow. "I'm denying your application, Miss Price. You've been rejected." The words landed like stones. Rejected, denied, unfit. The silence in the building was absolute. Every person in the waiting room was frozen, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding in the open doorway. Danny stood up slowly, her movements measured and graceful. She did not argue. She did not cry. She did not show them a single crack in her composure. She simply looked at Martha Whitcomb, a long, quiet look that held a universe of meaning. Then, she picked up her simple cloth purse, turned, and walked out of the office. She walked with a poise that defied the degradation she had just endured, her head held high, leaving the stunned, heavy silence of the waiting room to trail behind her like a shadow. Danny pushed through the glass doors of the agency and stepped out onto the sun-drenched sidewalk. The warmth of the Georgia afternoon felt like a distant planet compared to the icy atmosphere inside. She took a deep, deliberate breath, filling her lungs with the clean air, and then slowly let it out. For the first time since walking in, she allowed her body to react. Her hands, which had been so steady, began to tremble, just a little. It wasn't a tremor of anger or fear. It was the vibration of immense power held carefully in check, like a high-tension wire humming with unseen energy. She knew this could happen. She had prepared for this exact outcome, but knowing it and feeling it were two different things. The casual cruelty, the public shaming. It didn't just sting, it affirmed the sickness she had come to diagnose. And that didn't make it right. It made it necessary to. Back inside, Luis Ramirez, the young intern, watched her go. His heart was pounding in his chest. He was a good kid, raised by a hard-working family who had taught him to respect others, no matter who they were. What he had just witnessed felt like a betrayal of everything he believed in. He saw Martha Whitcomb step out of her office, a smug, satisfied smile on her face. She looked at him, and he quickly averted his gaze, pretending to be busy organizing a stack of pamphlets, but he could feel her glare, a warning to stay silent, to mind his place. He was just an intern, a powerless cog in this machine. Speaking up could cost him his position, a position he desperately needed. But the image of Danielle Price's dignified exit was burned into his mind. He couldn't shake it. He watched as Martha sauntered over to another long-term staff member, a woman named Carol who shared her sour disposition. "Can you believe the nerve of that woman?" Martha said, her voice a low, vicious laugh. "Walking in here dressed like she just rolled out of bed, thinking we'd just hand over a child to her. She probably takes the bus." Carol chuckled along with her, a dry, rasping sound. "You did the right thing, Martha. We have to protect the children and our reputation." Their laughter was ugly, a sound of casual cruelty that made Luis's stomach turn. He felt a surge of something hot and unfamiliar in his chest. Outrage. He looked from their sneering faces to the glass door through which Danny had disappeared. He had to do something. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was a compulsion. He mumbled an excuse about taking a break and quickly followed Danny outside. He spotted her a few paces down the sidewalk, standing still, looking at her phone. He jogged to catch up. "Hey, ma'am," he called out, his voice a little breathless. Danny turned, her expression unreadable but not unkind. Luis slowed to a stop in front of her. I work in there. I'm an intern. I just wanted to say, that wasn't right. What she did. I'm so sorry." He stumbled over his words, his sincerity making them clumsy. She does that sometimes, to people like us. He gestured vaguely between himself, a young Hispanic man, and her, a black woman. He felt the shared understanding of being judged on sight. A slow, genuine smile spread across Danny's face, and it transformed her. The tension left her eyes, replaced by a warmth that was startling. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was kind. "That means a lot. My name is Danny." "Luis," he replied, shaking the hand she offered. "Don't you worry about what happened in there, Luis," she said, her smile turning into something more determined, more strategic. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." The quiet confidence in her voice surprised him. There was no hint of the victim in her tone. There was only resolve. She gave him a small, appreciative nod, then turned her attention back to her phone. Luis hesitated for a moment, then walked back toward the agency, a newfound sense of purpose solidifying within him. He lingered by the door, watching Martha and Carol through the glass, their casual prejudice now looking monstrous to him. He had seen the system's ugliness up close, and he could no longer pretend it wasn't there. Meanwhile, Danny scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering over a name saved simply as Galloway. She pressed the call button. The line connected almost instantly. "Galloway," a professional voice answered. "It's me," Danny said calmly, her voice now devoid of the warmth she'd shown Luis. It was the voice of a commander, of someone used to giving orders and having them followed without question. "It's time." There was a brief pause on the other end. "How bad was it?" the voice asked. "Worse than we thought," Danny replied, her gaze fixed on the sterile building of the Georgia Family Aspirations Agency. "Set the board meeting for Friday, an emergency session. I want the entire board of the foundation present. We need to have a serious talk about the Whitcomb branch." "Consider it done, Miss Price," Galloway said. Danny hung up, without another word. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, the slight tremble in her hands now completely gone. It was replaced by the unshakable stillness of a predator that had just identified its prey. The humiliation was over. The hunt had just begun. Years before the world knew her name, Danielle Price was just a brilliant mind fueled by instant noodles and a relentless ambition. Her world was a cluttered garage, filled with humming servers, tangled wires, and whiteboards covered in complex algorithms that looked like a foreign language to anyone but her. This was the birthplace of CoreReach, a revolutionary tech platform she built from the ground up. It started as a small project, an idea scribbled on a napkin, and grew into a global force. CoreReach was a platform that combined mental health resources with personalized education tools, using sophisticated AI to help people navigate life's biggest challenges. It was a lifeline for millions, and it made Danny Price a billionaire. By the time CoreReach was valued at $4.2 billion, Danny had already made a life-altering decision. She would not become a prisoner of her own wealth. She didn't want the yachts, the mansions, or the blinding glare of the public eye. She wanted something simpler, something real. So she created a ghost, a silent benefactor, who moved through the world of philanthropy unseen. She set up a series of foundations and trusts, all operating under anonymous charters. Through these channels, she quietly funneled hundreds of millions of dollars into social welfare programs. She funded homeless shelters, food banks, and educational grants for underprivileged students, and she had a special place in her heart for child welfare. She poured a fortune into reforming the broken foster care system, funding 3 major adoption agencies across the state of Georgia. One of these agencies was Georgia Family Aspirations. The very agency whose director had just looked her in the eye and called her a charity case. Danny didn't flaunt her wealth because she saw no value in it. A designer handbag couldn't solve systemic inequality. A luxury car couldn't heal a child's trauma. She wore hoodies because they were comfortable. She lived in a modest, beautiful home in a quiet neighborhood because it felt like a sanctuary, not a showcase. Her life was a deliberate choice, a rebellion against the idea that worth was measured in dollar signs. This visit to Martha Whitcomb's branch wasn't her first. For months she had been conducting a silent audit, a first-hand investigation into how the agencies she funded actually treated the people they were meant to serve. She had visited other branches, sometimes as a potential volunteer, sometimes as an applicant asking for initial information. She sat in their waiting rooms, listened to the hushed conversations, and observed. What she saw had been a slow, creeping heartbreak. She saw inefficiency, bureaucracy, and a soul-crushing lack of empathy. But in Martha Whitcomb's branch, she saw something more sinister. She saw a deep, rotting prejudice that hid behind a mask of professionalism. Today wasn't just a random bad day. It was the culmination of everything she had feared. This wasn't just a flawed system, it was a poisoned well. And she, Danielle Price, the woman behind the code, the ghost in the machine, was the only one who had the power to drain it. Danny's drive to fix the broken world of child welfare wasn't born in a boardroom. It was forged in the lonely hallways of her own childhood. Before she was a billionaire, before she was a tech genius, she was just a little girl in the system, abandoned by parents she barely remembered. Danny was shuffled from one foster home to another, a piece of luggage without a destination. She knew the sting of being unwanted, the hollow ache of temporary homes and temporary families. She remembered lying awake at night, staring at unfamiliar ceilings, praying for a place to belong. She remembered the well-meaning but overworked social workers, the other lost children with haunted eyes, and the constant gnawing feeling that she was invisible. That feeling never truly left her. It became the fuel for her ambition. She promised herself that if she ever found a way out, if she ever gained any power in the world, she would dedicate her life to changing that story for other children. She would build a world where no child felt as invisible as she once had. Her mission became deeply personal when she first saw the picture of Ava. It was in a file sent to her foundation, a profile of a child who was considered difficult to place. Ava was 6 years old, had been in 3 different foster homes in 2 years, and was starting to withdraw into herself. When Danny saw her photo, the bright, curious eyes, the fragile smile, she saw a reflection of her own past. She saw the same flicker of hope, the same vulnerability. In that moment, Ava wasn't just a case file, she was a promise Danny had to keep. She could have used her influence to fast-track the adoption. A single phone call could have cleared every bureaucratic hurdle, but that wouldn't have fixed the problem. It would have just been a temporary solution for one child, while thousands of others remained trapped in the same broken system. What about the loving, capable parents who didn't have billions of dollars? What about the families who were turned away because they didn't look the part? So she made a decision. She would go undercover. She would become a regular applicant, a nobody with a perfect file but a plain appearance. She would walk into the lion's den wearing a hoodie and sneakers, and see for herself how the system treated the people it was supposed to help. What she saw had chipped away at her soul. The subtle racism, the classism disguised as discretion, the cold, uncaring bureaucracy that treated children like commodities. The experience with Martha Whitcomb was the final devastating piece of evidence. Driving home from the agency, Danny's jaw was clenched, so tight it ached. The polite mask she had worn was gone, replaced by a look of cold, hard fury. The humiliation had faded, replaced by a white-hot clarity of purpose. This was never just about adopting Ava. It was about dismantling the machine of prejudice that Martha Whitcomb had so proudly built. Danny wasn't going to fight back with rage and shouting. That was Martha's game. She was going to fight with facts, with evidence, with the undeniable, crushing weight of the truth. She was going to dismantle the system, piece by piece, with receipts, and she would not stop until the job was done. Inside the sterile offices of the Family Aspirations Agency, Luis Ramirez felt like a ghost. He moved through the hallways, performing his menial intern duties, making copies, refilling coffee, sorting mail, but his mind was miles away. He couldn't stop replaying the scene in Martha's office, the smug cruelty in her voice, the stunned silence of the waiting room, and the unshakable dignity of the woman in the grey hoodie. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had witnessed something profoundly wrong. Lewis knew what it was like to be powerless. His father was a brilliant carpenter, a man who could build a house with his bare hands, but he was also undocumented. Lewis had grown up watching his parents navigate a world that was constantly suspicious of them, a world where they had to be twice as good, just to be considered equal. He knew the sting of being judged by his last name, of being seen as less. That was why Martha's treatment of Danny had cut so deep. He saw his own family in her. He saw their struggle, their quiet dignity in the face of a world that often refused to see their worth. For a few hours he tried to push it down. He told himself to stay quiet. Don't make waves. You need this internship. It's your way out, your path to a better life. But then he pictured Danny's face when she had smiled at him on the sidewalk. This isn't over, she had said. The words echoed in his head. She wasn't giving up. How could he? The debate raging inside him was a silent, agonizing war. Fear versus conscience. Self-preservation versus justice. Finally, as the afternoon wore on, his conscience won. He couldn't live with himself if he did nothing. He looked over at Martha's office. She was on the phone, laughing about something. Now was his chance. His heart hammered against his ribs as he walked over to the main filing cabinet. His hands were slick with sweat. He pulled open the drawer labeled P, his fingers fumbling as he searched for Price. Danielle. He found her file, the one Martha had sneered at just hours before. He quickly carried it to the copy machine, his eyes darting around the office, terrified of being caught. He copied every single page, the perfect financial records, the glowing letters of recommendation, the flawless psychological evaluations. Next, he went to the front desk. The other staff members were busy with their own work. He logged into the security system, his hands shaking so badly he had to type the password twice. He found the footage from that morning. He saved the clips from the waiting room and from the camera just outside Martha's office, the footage that captured her loud, humiliating pronouncements for the entire world to hear. He saved them to a thumb drive. His final act was the riskiest. He walked calmly into Martha's now empty office. She had gone to get coffee. On her desk, lying in the rejection tray, was the official denial letter she had written for Danny's file. It was cold, formal, and brutal. He quickly scanned it. Applicant fails to meet the socioeconomic standards required by this agency. He took a picture of it with his phone. Then, he noticed something else. On a notepad by her computer, Martha had scribbled a list of names under the heading Purge List. Doe. Danielle Price's name was at the top. She was going to erase her from the system completely. That night, Luis went to a public library. He created a new, anonymous email address. He uploaded everything. The copies of Danny's pristine application, the damning CCTV clips, the photo of the rejection letter, and the picture of the purge list. He found the general contact email for the foundation that funded the agency. The anonymous one Danny secretly controlled. He didn't know who would read it, but he had to try. He attached all the files. In the body of the email, he wrote a short, simple note. To whom it may concern, I am an intern at the Georgia Family Aspirations Agency. Today, a good woman named Danielle Price was humiliated and unfairly rejected by our director, Martha Whitcomb. She didn't deserve what happened to her. This kind of thing happens more than you know. I have attached proof. If there is anything that can be done to make this right, please do it. I am willing to help in any way I can. He signed it simply, a concerned intern. He stared at the screen for a full minute, his finger hovering over the send button. This could ruin his life. It could get him fired. It could have unforeseen consequences for his family. But then he thought of Danny's quiet strength. He thought of his father's calloused hands and his mother's tired smile. He took a deep breath and clicked send. The email disappeared into the digital void, a small act of rebellion sent out into the darkness, hoping to find the light. A few days later, Martha Whitcomb was in her element. She stood at a podium in a lavishly decorated ballroom, addressing a room full of the agency's top donors at a private luncheon. She was wearing her finest Chanel suit and a smile that was both charming and predatory. This was where she thrived. She loved schmoozing with the wealthy, making them feel like their money was not just a donation, but an investment in her superior judgment. And so, she said, her voice smooth as silk, we continue to uphold the highest standards for our adoptive families. It isn't always easy. We must remain vigilant. She paused, scanning the room of well-dressed, influential people. We have had to be quite firm in cleaning out some of the, shall we say, riffraff from the applicant pool recently. A few polite, uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the room. This was Martha's favorite kind of joke, one that punched down, but was veiled in the language of high standards. She felt emboldened by the laughter. She decided to press her advantage, to tell the story that had become her favorite new anecdote. Just the other day, she continued, leaning into the microphone conspiratorially, a woman came into our office, dressed in rags, frankly. And she truly believed she had the right to one of our children. Can you imagine? She shook her head in mock disbelief. It's a symptom of the times, I suppose. These people hear a sad story on the news and suddenly think that's all it takes to be a parent. They don't understand the resources, the culture, the stability required. She was on a roll now, drunk on the power of her position, and the perceived approval of the wealthy patrons hanging on her every word. She didn't notice the way the mood in the room had subtly shifted. The chuckles had died down, replaced by a tense, awkward silence. She didn't see the way a few of the guests were now looking at their plates, their faces tight with discomfort. And she certainly didn't notice the man sitting at a table near the front. His name was Mr. Harrison, a quiet older gentleman who sat on the board of the very foundation that funneled Danielle Price's money to this agency. He was a trusted friend of Danny's late father, and one of the few people who knew the true extent of her anonymous philanthropy. As Martha spoke, Mr. Harrison had been idly scanning the wall of rejection, a small, distasteful display Martha had created near the back of the room, showcasing pictures of recently denied applicants, meant to highlight her rigorous screening process. His eyes landed on a familiar name next to a grainy black and white photo, Danielle Price. His blood ran cold. He looked from the name on the wall to the preening woman at the podium, who was now taking a sip of water, basking in what she thought was the glow of admiration. He felt a surge of protective fury for Danny. He knew her story. He knew her heart, and he knew the immense, quiet power she wielded. Martha had no idea who she had mocked. She had no idea whose name she had just slandered in a room full of the very people who signed her checks. She had just insulted her own queen, thinking she was a peasant. Mr. Harrison discreetly pulled out his phone under the table. He excused himself, pretending to take an important business call. He walked swiftly out of the ballroom and into the quiet hallway, his face a grim mask of anger. He dialed a number he knew by heart. Danny picked up on the second ring. "Danny, it's Robert Harrison," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I'm at the donor luncheon for the Whitcomb branch." "Robert," Danny's voice was calm. "Is everything all right?" "No," he said, his voice tight with rage. "It's not. She's here. Martha Whitcomb. And she's talking. She's telling the whole room about how she rejected some poor woman in a hoodie. She's using you as a punchline to get laughs from the donors." He paused, taking a breath to control his anger. "She has no clue, Danny. Absolutely no clue who she just publicly humiliated." On the other end of the line, there was only silence. But it was a heavy silence, filled with the weight of impending consequences. Robert Harrison knew that silence. It was the calm before a storm. Martha Whitcomb had just made the biggest mistake of her life, and she didn't even know it yet. The next day, Danny sat in her home office. It was a simple room, with clean lines and large windows that looked out onto a garden. There were no gold-plated awards on the walls, no monuments to her own success. There was just a large monitor, a keyboard, and a quiet sense of purpose. On the screen in front of her were the faces of the 7 board members of the Price Family Foundation, the central nervous system of her entire philanthropic empire. These were the people she trusted, the guardians of her mission. Harrison was among them, his face still grim from the day before. "Thank you all for joining on such short notice," Danny began, her voice calm and measured. There was no trace of the anger or humiliation she had felt. There was only the cold, hard precision of a surgeon about to make a critical incision. "I'm sure Miss Harrison has given you a brief overview of the situation, but I wanted you to see it for yourselves." She shared her screen. The first thing that appeared was the email from Luis Ramirez, a concerned intern. She read his short, powerful note aloud. A few of the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This email, Danny continued, contained a number of attachments. I'd like to play one for you now. She clicked a file. The grainy CCTV footage filled the screen. The board watched in stunned silence as the events of that day unfolded. They saw Danny walk in, hopeful and patient. They saw Martha Whitcomb call her into her office, and because of the open door and the sensitive microphone on the security camera, they heard every single word of Martha's condescending, cruel tirade. They heard her call Danny a charity case. They heard her say, "You don't look like someone who could care for a child." A wave of shock and disgust washed over the faces on the screen. One board member, a formidable woman named Eleanor Vance, gasped and put a hand over her mouth. Mr. Harrison simply shook his head, his jaw tight. Danny didn't stop there. She pulled up the photo Louise had taken of the rejection letter. Its official language about socio-economic standards, feeling even more vile after hearing the raw prejudice behind it. Then she showed them the picture of the notepad. The purge list. She intended to erase my existence from the agency's records, Danny stated, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. To pretend this interaction never happened. This is not just poor judgment. This is a calculated act of discrimination, followed by an attempt to cover it up. The virtual room was electric with outrage. This is horrifying, Eleanor Vance said, her voice shaking with anger. That woman is operating that branch like it's her own personal kingdom. She's using our money, your money, Danny, to perpetuate the very prejudices we are trying to fight. Another board member, a sharp lawyer named Ben Carter, spoke up. This is a massive liability. Forget the ethics for a moment. The legal exposure is catastrophic. We need to launch an immediate and full-scale audit of that branch. The other members chimed in, their voices a chorus of agreement and fury. They demanded action. They wanted investigations, audits, immediate suspensions. Danny let them speak, letting their outrage build. She had known this would be their reaction. These were good people who believed in the work they were doing. She had simply shown them the cancer that had been growing in their own body. When they finally fell silent, all eyes turned back to her, waiting for her command. She was the one who had been wronged. She was the one who had been wronged. She was the one who held all the cards. Danny took a slow breath. An audit is a good first step, she said, her voice cutting through the anger with quiet authority. But it's not enough. I want to see this for myself. I want them to see me. She looked directly into the camera, her gaze sweeping over each board member. I will be attending the Whitcomb branch's weekly staff meeting this Friday. I want all decision-makers present, every single one. There was a pause, and then Mr. Harrison smiled, a grim, satisfied smile. What do you need from us, Danny? I need 3 of you to come with me, she replied. And Ben, I want you to bring a legal representative from the Foundation's council. She looked at them all, one by one. No one is to know who I am until I introduce myself. As far as they know, you are simply board members conducting a surprise check-in. Is that clear? It was perfectly clear. This wasn't just going to be an audit. It was going to be a reckoning. And it would be delivered in person. The following morning, Danny picked up her phone. She didn't scroll through her main contacts. Instead, she accessed a secure, encrypted list reserved for the highest level of communication. She found the direct, private line for the national director of the parent non-profit that governed all the agencies her foundation supported. This was not a number you called to make a friendly inquiry. It was a red phone, a direct link to the very top of the food chain, reserved for 7-figure donors and emergency situations. The director, a man named Alan Peterson, answered on the first ring, his voice professionally polished. Alan Peterson speaking. Mr. Peterson, this is Danielle Price, Danny said. Her voice was calm, controlled, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the voice of a CEO, not a victim. There was a beat of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Alan Peterson knew exactly who Danielle Price was. He didn't know her personally. She was famously private, but he knew her as the single largest anonymous benefactor his organization had. He knew her as the quiet force, whose massive, regular donations kept the lights on in dozens of branches, including the one in suburban Georgia, Her name was spoken with a kind of reverence and mystery in their highest-level financial meetings. For her to be calling him directly, using this line, meant something was very, very wrong. His professional tone instantly shifted to one of deep concern and deference. "Miss Price, this is an unexpected honor. Is everything all right?" "No, Mr. Peterson, it is not," Danny replied, her voice as crisp and cold as ice. "I am calling regarding a deeply disturbing incident that occurred at your Georgia Family Aspirations branch, managed by a Ms. Martha Whitcomb." Peterson audibly swallowed. I see. Please, tell me what happened." Danny did not tell him the whole story. She didn't need to. She simply laid out the core facts with devastating emotionless precision. "There has been a formal complaint of discrimination and unethical conduct filed against Ms. Whitcomb. My foundation has reviewed the preliminary evidence, and we find it credible and deeply alarming." She let that sink in. The implication was clear. Her foundation, his biggest source of funding, was now officially involved. "I will be personally attending the branch's staff meeting this Friday morning to address the matter," Danny continued, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. "I expect every key employee at that branch to be present. I want the entire management team in that room, and you will ensure that Martha Whitcomb is there. Am I understood?" "Yes, of course, Miss Price," Peterson stammered, his mind no doubt racing, scrambling to understand the scope of the disaster that had just landed on his desk. "I will make the call immediately. The entire branch will be at your complete disposal. Whatever you need, I need you to do nothing else," Danny said, cutting him off before he could offer any more frantic promises. "Just make sure they are all there. That is all." She hung up the phone. She didn't slam it down. She just pressed the end call button with a quiet finality. The call had lasted less than 2 minutes. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't made threats. She had simply delivered a message. A quiet, focused display of power that was more terrifying than any outburst. In an office hundreds of miles away, Alan Peterson was likely breaking out in a cold sweat, making the most frantic phone call of his career. And in Georgia, a trap was quietly being set. Friday was coming. Friday morning arrived with a bright, cheerful sun that seemed entirely unaware of the storm that was about to break. Inside the Georgia Family Aspirations Agency, the mood was one of nervous energy. Martha Whitcomb had received a call from the national director himself, Alan Peterson, informing her of a surprise donor check-in with members of the board. Martha was thrilled. This was her chance to shine, to impress the people who held the purse string. She had spent the morning bragging to her staff about how the national office was clearly taking notice of her efficient and effective management style. She wore her most expensive pearls and a pair of designer heels that clicked authoritatively on the linoleum floor. She had even brought in pastries for the meeting, a gesture of confident hospitality. She instructed her staff to look sharp, to be prepared to answer questions about their success rates. In her mind, this was a victory lap. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. At 9:45, the staff gathered in the conference room. Martha stood at the head of the table, beaming, ready to perform. The first person to arrive was not a board member. It was Luis Ramirez. He walked in quietly and took a seat against the wall, not at the main table. Martha shot him a quizzical, annoyed look. What was the intern doing here? She opened her mouth to tell him to leave, but before she could speak, the main door to the agency opened again. 3 people walked in. They were impeccably dressed, their faces serious and unsmiling. Martha recognized one of them from photos, Ben Carter, the foundation's top lawyer. Her confident smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. This felt more serious than a simple check-in. The 3 board members walked into the conference room without a word and took seats at the table, their briefcases clicking shut, with an air of ominous finality. A 4th man, a legal representative, stood silently by the door. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted. The nervous energy curdled into thick, palpable tension. Martha's staff exchanged uneasy glances. Her own heart began to beat a little faster. Then, the agency's main door opened one last time. Every head turned. Everyone froze. A woman stepped inside, flanked by her own lawyer. She was wearing a stunning dark blue business suit that was clearly tailored to perfection. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek, elegant style. A single, tasteful diamond pin glittered on her lapel. Her face was calm. Her posture radiated an unshakable confidence. It was the woman in the hoodie. A chilling stillness fell over the room. Martha Whitcomb's face drained of all color. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The pen she had been holding, ready to take triumphant notes, slipped from her numb fingers and clattered onto the polished surface of the conference table. The sound was unnaturally loud in the dead silence. The other staff members stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. They looked from the powerful, poised woman at the door to their pale, shell-shocked director. The two images didn't compute. It was like watching a ghost walk into the room, dressed for war. Danielle Price had returned. Danny walked calmly into the conference room, her heels making a soft, deliberate clicking sound on the floor. She took her place at the head of the table, directly opposite a ghostly white Martha Whitcomb. Her lawyer sat beside her, opening a briefcase full of documents. The three board members and their legal counsel sat like stone statues, their gazes fixed on Martha. The room was so quiet you could hear the frantic pounding of Martha's heart. The other staff members looked at each other, their faces filled with a dawning, terrible understanding. This was not a check-in. This was an execution. Danny let the silence stretch for a long, painful moment. She looked around the table, her eyes meeting the gaze of each staff member one by one, before finally settling on the woman who had humiliated her. "Good morning," Danny said, her voice perfectly calm, yet it carried an authority that filled every corner of the room. "Thank you all for being here. For those of you who don't know me, allow me to introduce myself." She paused, letting the anticipation build to an unbearable level. "My name is Danielle Price." She let her name hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final, devastating blow. "I am the founder of the Price Family Foundation. I am the anonymous donor who provides 60% of this agency's annual operating budget. In short, I am the fund controller for the non-profit that signs your paychecks." A collective gasp echoed around the table. It was a soft, wounded sound. One of the senior cast workers audibly whispered, "Oh my God." Martha Whitcomb looked as though she had been physically struck. She swayed slightly in her chair, her face a mask of utter disbelief and horror. The woman she had called a charity case, the woman she had mocked for her clothes, was the billionaire benefactor she had been preparing to impress. The irony was so thick, it was suffocating. Danny didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were quiet, precise, and more powerful than any shout. "I founded my organization with a single guiding principle: to ensure that every child has a chance at a life filled with dignity, respect, and love. To do that, we fund agencies like this one, trusting them to be the guardians of that mission on the ground." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "So I decided to see for myself how that mission was being carried out. I came to this branch not as a donor, but as an applicant. I wanted the real, unfiltered experience." Her eyes narrowed, and what I saw firsthand was not just a lack of professionalism. It was not just prejudice. It was a culture of deliberate systemic cruelty, championed from the very top. At that moment, as if on cue, Luis Ramirez stood up from his chair against the wall. He walked to the table and placed a thick file in front of the board members. It was a copy of Danny's perfect application. "This board has already been briefed," Danny continued, her voice like steel. "We have reviewed CCTV footage of my interaction with Ms. Whitcomb. We have heard the words she used." She picked up a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of the rejection letter, "and we have read the official reason for my denial." She read the line aloud, her voice dripping with cold irony. "Applicant fails to meet the socioeconomic standards required by this agency." She placed the paper down gently. The silence that followed was heavy and final. There was nothing to debate. There was no defense. The evidence was absolute, and the judge, jury, and executioner were all sitting at the same table. Martha Whitcomb had been tried and convicted, and she never even saw the trial coming. Martha Whitcomb finally found her voice, but it was a pathetic, stuttering wreck of what it once was. I didn't know," she stammered, her eyes darting frantically between Danny and the stone-faced board members. "It was a misunderstanding. She didn't look like—" She trailed off, the words dying in her throat, as she realized the massive hole she had just dug for herself. "She didn't look like what, Martha?" Danny asked, her voice flat and dangerously quiet. "A billionaire? A donor? or just a human being deserving of basic respect? She didn't wait for an answer. You said that part out loud. The part about how I don't look like I can care for a child. We have it on video. Martha flinched, as if she'd been slapped. The color had completely vanished from her face, leaving behind a pasty gray pallor. She looked around the room, searching for an ally, for any sign of support, but she found none. Her staff, the people she had ruled over with fear and condescension, refused to meet her gaze. They stared at the table, at their hands, at anywhere but her. They were not just abandoning a sinking ship, they were relieved to see it go down. The board chair, Eleanor Vance, who had been watching the entire exchange with cold fury, finally spoke. Her voice was resolute and final, leaving no room for appeal. Martha Whitcomb, she said, her words ringing with authority. Your actions were a flagrant violation of this organization's code of conduct. They were unethical, discriminatory, and a profound betrayal of the trust placed in you by this board, and more importantly, by the children and families you were meant to serve. Eleanor didn't even look at Martha as she delivered the sentence. She addressed the room. As of this moment, your employment with Georgia Family Aspirations is terminated. Effective immediately. The words hung in the air, absolute and irreversible, terminated. Ben Carter, the lawyer, nodded to the legal representative standing by the door. Her email has been frozen. Her access to all agency systems has been revoked. Security has been notified and is on their way to escort her from the premises. Martha just sat there, stunned into silence, her mind unable to process the speed and finality of her own destruction. 1 minute, she was the queen of her own little kingdom. The next, she was nothing. As 2 uniformed security guards entered the room, she finally looked at Danny, her eyes blazing with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. It was the glare of a tyrant who had been toppled, a person so blinded by their own arrogance, they couldn't comprehend how it had all gone so wrong. Danny did not return the glare. She didn't even look at her. She was already looking at the other staff members, her mind already on the next step, rebuilding. Martha Whitcomb was a symptom of the disease, not the disease itself. As the security guards politely but firmly asked Martha to gather her personal belongings, Danny's lack of attention was the final, most devastating blow. It told Martha that this was never about her. She was just a footnote in a much larger story, a problem that had now been solved, and she was already being forgotten. Once the door closed behind the disgraced Martha Whitcomb, a heavy silence fell over the room. The remaining staff members sat frozen, unsure of what would happen next. They had just witnessed the complete collapse of their workplace hierarchy. Danny let the silence settle for a moment, then her gaze softened slightly. I know this has been a difficult morning for everyone, she said, her tone shifting from ice to cool professionalism. But this is not the end. It's a new beginning. Her eyes found Luis Ramirez, who was still standing quietly by the wall, his heart pounding. Luis, Danny said, a hint of warmth returning to her voice. Could you please step forward? Luis looked up, surprised. He walked hesitantly toward the head of the table. He felt the eyes of every senior staff member on him, the intern who had played a secret, pivotal role in this corporate coup. Eleanor Vance, the board chair, smiled at him. It was a genuine, appreciative smile. Luis, she began, the board has reviewed the information you provided. It took immense courage and integrity to do what you did. You stood up for what was right, even at great personal risk. That is a quality we value above all others. Luis felt a blush creep up his neck. I just did what I thought was right, he mumbled, overwhelmed. And for that, we want to reward you, Eleanor continued. We are offering you a full-time position as a junior case manager, effective today. We are also putting you on a fast-track management program. We need people with your moral compass in leadership positions. Luis's jaw dropped. A full-time job. A management track. It was more than he had ever dreamed of. He looked at Danny, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. But Danny wasn't finished. She turned to the board. I have another proposal, she said. I want Luis to be the one to oversee the rollout of new equity and sensitivity training programs. Not just for this branch, but for all the agencies we fund. He knows what to look for. He knows what decency looks like. The board members immediately agreed. Luis Ramirez, the intern who had been invisible just a week ago, was now a key agent of change for the entire organization. Then, Danny delivered her final surprise, a move that shifted the focus from punishment to progress. I know that Ms. Whitcomb's socio-economic standards have likely turned away many wonderful, capable parents who simply didn't fit her narrow-minded profile, Danny said, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the staff. Parents who have the love, but maybe not the savings account she deemed appropriate. That ends today. She looked at her own lawyer, then back at the board. Effective immediately, I am doubling the annual budget specifically earmarked for community applicants. We will waive all application fees for families under a certain income threshold, and we will provide grants to help with adoption costs. We are going to find the parents this agency turned away, and we are going to tell them that our doors are wide open. This time the gasps in the room were not of shock or horror. They were gasps of hope. A few of the younger caseworkers, who had long been troubled by Martha's policies, broke into wide smiles. One of them let out a small involuntary cheer. The oppressive, fearful atmosphere that had choked this office for years was finally lifting, replaced by the fresh, clean air of possibility. Danny hadn't just fired a bad manager, she had fundamentally changed the mission of the agency itself, redirecting its power and its money back to the people it was always meant to serve. Several weeks later, the front door of a beautiful but unpretentious house swung open. The afternoon sun streamed into a warm, inviting foyer. Danny Price stood in the doorway, her face lit up with a joy so pure it seemed to glow. A little girl with bright, curious eyes and a slightly hesitant smile stood on the doorstep, holding the hand of a social worker. It was Ava. The social worker smiled at Danny. "She's all yours," she said softly. Ava looked up at Danny, her expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. After the events at the agency, Danny's adoption application had been immediately reopened and approved by the new interim director, Luis Ramirez. The process had been swift, professional, and filled with the kindness and respect that had been so brutally absent before. Danny knelt down, so she was at eye level with the little girl. "Hi, Ava," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm Danny. I've been waiting a long time to meet you properly." Ava clutched a warm, stuffed teddy bear a little tighter. She gave a small, shy nod.
"Welcome home," Danny said.
She led Ava inside. The house wasn't a palace. There were no marble floors or crystal chandeliers. It was a home, filled with comfortable furniture, shelves overflowing with books, and the smell of freshly baked cookies. It was a place designed for living, not for showing off. They sat down on a large, soft couch in the living room. For a few moments, they just sat in comfortable silence. Ava looked around the room, taking in her new surroundings. Her eyes, which had held so much uncertainty, began to relax. Danny pointed to a small, fluffy bed in the corner of the room. "That's for your bear," she said with a smile, "in case he gets tired." A tiny giggle escaped Ava's lips. It was the first sound she had made. It was the most beautiful sound Danny had ever heard. Ava finally looked up at Danny, her gaze direct and searching. "Is this my forever home?" she asked, her voice a small whisper. Danny felt her heart swell. She reached out and gently squeezed Ava's hand. "Yes," she said, her own voice thick with emotion. "You're home now. For good." Ava leaned her head against Danny's arm, a silent gesture of trust and acceptance. They sat there together, a new family forged, not from biology, but from a promise that Danny had made to a lonely little girl inside herself years ago, and a promise she had just fulfilled for the precious child now resting beside her. The fight had been worth it. The humiliation had been worth it. It had all led to this perfect, quiet moment of belonging. The changes started almost immediately. The first ripple was the complete overhaul of the training programs at every agency the Price Family Foundation supported. Under Luis Ramirez's guidance, new modules were created, focusing on implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and trauma-informed care. It was no longer enough to just process paperwork. Staff were now trained to see the human being behind every application. The second ripple was the outreach. The community applicant fund that Danny had established became a beacon of hope. Mobile application centers were set up in underserved neighborhoods. Workshops were held in community centers, demystifying the adoption process and removing the financial barriers that had kept so many loving families away. The message was clear. Your heart matters more than your wallet. The third, and most important, ripple was the change in oversight. Anonymous secret shoppers, much like Danny had been, were now regularly deployed to all branches. They were regular people from all walks of life, paid by the foundation to go through the application process and report on their experiences. Directors and caseworkers knew that any person who walked through their door could be an auditor in disguise. The fear of being judged was replaced by a culture of accountability. You treated everyone with dignity, because it was the right thing to do, and because you never knew who was watching. Danielle Price never took a public role in any of it. She remained in the background, the silent guiding force. She reviewed the reports from her home office, approved funding for new initiatives, and continued to pour her resources and her heart into fixing the system from the inside out. She attended board meetings via video call, her face a familiar, steady presence among the foundation's leaders. She had won, but her victory wasn't loud or boastful. It was quiet, systemic, and lasting. She hadn't just removed one bad apple, she had changed the soil in which the entire orchard grew, ensuring that for generations to come, children like Ava would have a better chance at finding a home, and parents like the woman she pretended to be would be judged not by the clothes they wore, but by the love they had to give. She had changed everything without ever having to raise her voice. They saw the hoodie, and they missed the billionaire. They judged her for a simple piece of clothing, and they were blind to the immense power she held, a power she had earned through brilliance and hard work. They saw a quiet woman, and they missed the silent warrior who was about to dismantle their entire world. They saw poor. They looked at her faded jeans and worn sneakers and wrote her off as a charity case. They missed the loving, capable mother underneath, a woman with more resources in her heart and in her bank account than they could ever comprehend. Their prejudice made them see scarcity where there was endless abundance. They saw black, and in their small minds that single fact was a disqualification. They saw a stereotype, not a person. They let their bigotry cloud their judgment, and in doing so revealed the rotten core of their own character. They judged the color of her skin instead of the content of her character. But she saw a broken system. She looked past the insults, the humiliation, and the personal attacks. She saw the bigger picture. She saw a machine that was hurting innocent people, a system that was failing the very children it was meant to protect. And she knew she had to fix it. She didn't seek revenge. She sought reform. She didn't just tear it down. She built something better in its place. The next time you judge someone by what they wear, by where they come from, or by the color of their skin, remember this story. Remember the woman in the hoodie. Remember that true worth is not what you see on the outside, but the power, the love, and the courage that lies within the heart. If this story about dignity and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below.